on occasion of the publication of Kristof's memoir, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life. The book, which also covers Kristof's storied career and travels across the globe, is available for purchase in the lobby, and there are a number of pre-signed copies there as well. Moderating the conversation is Orville Schell, Director of Asia Society's Center on U.S. China Relations, former Dean at Berkeley's Graduate School on Journalism, and author of 10 books on China himself. This event is brought to you by China Books Review, a digital magazine on all things China and bookish, co-published by Asia Society and The Wire Digital. So we do encourage you to explore our fair at chinabooksreview.com, and that includes an excerpt from Kristof's memoir about setting up and settling into Beijing in 1988, and also an interview with Fox Butterfield about setting up that very same Beijing bureau for the Times back in 1979. If you enjoy the event, do sign up for our newsletter to see what's coming up, and also consider becoming a member of Asia Society for various free and discounted happenings. So, without further ado, I'll hand the stage over to Orville, and there will be a chance for audience questions at the end, so get thinking.
Well, thank you, Alec. Welcome to you all, and welcome to you, Sheryl and Nick. Let me just say at the outset, this book, Chasing Hope, I mean, I really did fall into it, and I was reading till about 1 o'clock last night. It's a wonderful evocation of many things. We're here because we're the Asia Society, and they've spent a lot of time in Asia, so we'll emphasize that. But also, their lives. I mean, 2 immigrant families. Really, really interesting. So let's start. I thought maybe we'd start, since you guys really did get together in the late 80s, both as husband and wife, around Hong Kong, China, and so how did that all happen? Sheryl, let's start with you.
Well, how are we introduced, you mean, right? How did we get to know each other?
Give us the story here.
Yeah, right. Well, we actually were both in LA. Nick was there for the New York Times as the business correspondent, and I had just finished business school and had I was working at the Wall Street Journal. And a friend of mine at the Journal also knew Nick. And I remember always thinking, every once in a while, when she was talking to someone, she would turn to French. And I thought, God, that's just, so arrogant. Just like, she's just elitist, turning to French. And it happened to be that she was speaking to Nick in French. They would speak in French together, because they would have these French parties. And so she decided to invite me to one of them. And I thought, I'm not sure.
Did they serve freedom fries?
Brie fries, right? And so she told me that she wanted to introduce me to a fellow alumni from my business school. And so I thought, okay, that's great. His name was Jack. And apparently, she told Nick that she was introducing Nick to me. So I had no idea what was going on. So I'm at this party and I'm talking to Jack, and then Nick's all of a sudden like coming and talking to me too, and they're both circling around, and I'm wondering what's going on. And then as Nick explains it, he was jockeying for a position because we were going to then drive to another restaurant, and he wanted me to go in the car with him. But I was supposed to go in the car with Jack. And so it turns out somehow I ended up in Nick's car.
Only time a journalist has ever beaten out an investment banker in fair competition, I got to say.
Good work, Nick.
And that's how it started.
Yeah. And so then Nick, you were deputized to open the Hong Kong bureau. And then how did you kind of get off to Asia together, and just quickly tell people here your sort of glide path over the next 7 years.
Well, so when I joined the New York Times was excited because I spoke Arabic, and they were and French, and so they were planning to send me to West Africa or to Cairo or Lebanon. And as with any bureaucracy, suddenly Hong Kong opened up, and so there I go off to Hong Kong. And
well, see, that was very critical because I was actually I was at graduate school, And so I said, as I was leaving LA, oh, well, this guy's going to the Middle East. That's not in my future. So I said, goodbye. And then he got posted to Hong Kong, and I'm like, oh, that changes
Here is a God.
things.
Non-Cartesian proof of a God.
So that was a critical switch.
And so I was, so the Times sent me to Hong Kong to open up a bureau. And, at that time, China, the New York Times only had one correspondent in all of China. And until I opened up the Hong Kong bureau, that person also covered Hong Kong and Taiwan. And so then I was there to open up the Hong Kong bureau and really travel around the region. And then I loved the assignment. Then Sheryl was she'd already been planning to come out to Hong Kong. And so this just felt like it really was divinely ordained. And then then the Times decided to send me on up to Beijing and to replace the Beijing correspondent. And so Sheryl and I, Sheryl already spoke some Chinese, and she was trying to teach me the tones, and so she said, ma, 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 ma. And I said, you just said ma 4 times. And I said, no, those are 4 different words, 4 different tones. And so I was kind of hopeless, but I spent a year, the Times sent me to study Chinese for a year in Taiwan. And then we were married here in New York and went off together to be an experiment in the New York Times in having a couple, cover a country together. And it was pretty glorious, frankly.
Any comments, Sheryl?
Well, I mean,
You better not disagree that it was glorious.
I wouldn't have used that word, but, it was, China kind of gets in your blood. I mean, it was just an incredible time. It was a heady time, but then obviously we were there for the crackdown too and the post-crackdown. So it was a really, really difficult time.
We were there for that incredibly open, wonderful, sort of inspiring, hopeful time.
Hopeful time, and it just, I thought that we would see it again at some point in the, ensuing 20 years, but unfortunately we never did.
Well, we will get to that.
Okay.
There was one thing, actually, that we learned right when we first moved into the New York Times apartment in Beijing that was a really useful lesson that I followed since. We had to live in the official New York Times apartment, and we knew that it was in a diplomatic compound, and we knew that it was bugged partly because one of our Chinese friends worked part-time for state security, translating conversations in our building. And we weren't obviously sure exactly where the bugs were, but then a friend pointed to this screened-off little cubby hole right inside the entrance and said, that's where the bugs are. And so when we were moving in, we thought, okay, we're going to get to the bottom of this. And we got a ladder, pried off this screen, and there is this little cubby hole with a bunch of electronic gadgets inside. And we were so proud because...
Well, actually, I was the one who read it.
We could read the Chinese characters on this gadget in front. And it was electronic sound carrying device.
Do you know what that is?
Well, I do know if I read the book.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. All right. Well, that was...
But I'm not going to give it away.
Yes.
So, we were just so excited that here we've just moved into Beijing. We found the bug. We feel triumphant. And we then, we were just debating, okay, do we leave the bug in place? Do we smash the bug? Do we leave it in place but use it as a disinformation channel? How many of you would have left the bug in place?
Raise your hands.
Okay. How many of you would have smashed it?
Oh, a few.
I'm just going to take a few names down. The Chinese embassy pays me. Okay. And how many of you would have left them in place and used them as a disinformation channel to state security?
Okay, yeah.
Well, great minds think alike. Sheryl and I were incredibly well prepared for this moment because we had read a lot of spy novels. So we adjourned to the bathroom and turned on the shower and whispered into each other's ears, and we just decided that we were going to use it as the disinformation channel when at that moment a friend arrived at the front door and we found out what an electronic sound carrying device is in Chinese. It's a doorbell buzzer. And it was just so useful to be deflated at that moment when you just feel like you really nailed it, you're so triumphant, you really figured this out. Just to remember that everything is always more complex than you expect. And that little gust of humility when we first arrived was useful in covering this vast country with, when we understood so little about it. And frankly, it was very useful as later in foreign correspondence in other countries, and now as a columnist when I parachute into a country and proclaim whither that country in 800 words. It's always useful to remember things are far more complicated than they seem if you think you really nailed it.
Well, it's also important because we actually investigated it, because our predecessor, of course, had envisioned that this was the bug the entire time and never knew that it wasn't the bug. So.
But of course, I mean, while this may not have been the bug, you did, even in those years, which were sort of halcyon years of relative openness and a sense of optimism, people were followed all the time. I remember coming to have lunch or something with you and being followed, and of course, we were all followed. I mean, that was a constraint.
We've been collaborating with Orville since the Han Dynasty.
Before surveillance, really, yeah. But I mean, this was a reality of life then, which interestingly never went away. And we sometimes imagine that those were the good old years of openness, but actually the system never completely demolished those sorts of constraints and controls.
Well, now they surveil everybody, not just us. No, with eyes and ears and cameras everywhere, and China has the most sophisticated technology when it comes to surveillance, far exceeding the U.S., far exceeding Britain, far exceeding any other country. They really are the most advanced when it comes to surveillance in all formats.
How do you two, maybe we'll explore this a little more later, but just quickly, how do you two look back on those years before 1989? I mean, you were there, what, for 2 years before?
No.
Less than a year.
Less than a year.
Right.
And then, of course, that happened. And when you look back on those years you spent, 5 in all, was it, in China?
Yeah.
What are you thinking?
I mean, there was an incredible ferment in that period before 1989. There had been a crackdown in 1986, but it was not a very effective one. Not really beginning of 1987. It was not a very effective one. And the intellectual ferment had continued. People were not intimidated. They would come to us and exchange ideas. We had we were able to have very good contacts with very senior people, which was very good preparation after Tiananmen tended to close things off. And there was this sense of excitement and, that the country was going to change. And it did, but not in the way we might have anticipated.
I mean, I would say that we found the openness allowed the Chinese to really, imagine, to really be creative in their thinking in many different fronts. Mm-hmm. So it was a flourishing time for artists as well. Mm-hmm. And so you just had people experimenting with all different styles. It was a flourishing time for political, theorizing and also political understanding. I mean, they were reading Rousseau, they were reading Western philosophers because they were allowed to. And then with the economy, there were people who were, already, there was Lenovo that was started, and they were just looking at computers and trying to figure out how they can build their own computers. And so there were so many fronts where China was really on the edge of being very inventive. And we could see even after the crackdown that China's inventiveness was very special, and that they actually, really were able to take off. But you can imagine if there was even more, a little bit more easing up on the political front, whether or not that also would have created a great more innovation. It's taken a while for them to be innovative, but I think the political stifling may have played a role in just, a little bit of creativity and inventiveness.
let me ask you both this. As you look back on those years, of course, after 1989, there was a crackdown, but things did open up again, more or less. Did you think during that period that there actually was the possibility that China would continue to peacefully evolve and change into something else? Or did you, in your heart of hearts, say, wait a minute, there's still a steel toe in this boot? The system hasn't changed and probably won't make it? What were you thinking?
There was always a question in our mind as to whether it really would work, but one indication that we thought it had the odds are in its favor is that the Chinese the government was worried about peaceful evolution. That was something they were very worried about, peaceful evolution. They were worried about Americans engaging with the Chinese. All the cultural troops that were visiting, the cultural exchanges and the business exchanges, and all the many evenings of over drinking Mao Tai and the dinners. They were worried about...
Even at the American embassy.
Yeah, they were just very worried about all that exchange of ideas, that this was going to pollute the Chinese over time, and that peaceful evolution would mean that China would become more Western. We never thought it would become Western, but that it was going to Westernize. It was going to adopt more values that were similar to Western values. I'm surprised that it didn't go farther.
Well, 89 stopped it, in effect, and then it started up again, but didn't quite
exactly.
get lift.
You thought that it would still, encroach and be very peaceful and quiet and slowly evolve. But, it has to some degree, but it also, obviously politically very, very strict.
Yeah, I mean, I would second that. We knew a bunch of the kids of leaders, and they were not ideological at all. And many of them did have some kind of many of them had studied in the West. They were intrigued by a lot of the Western model. And I remember we were in the home of one really innovative young official, and he was the arbiter an arbitrator in a legal case. And when we were there, his mom called up to say, the such and such company just delivered a new refrigerator to our house and a bunch of other stuff. And he said, don't take it. I'm arbitrator in a case involving them. Send him away. And he really had these values, and he cared about integrity and honesty. And then, visiting him in the years since, he became a fat cat as an official, and he lost that sense of integrity and those values. And I saw that in a lot of other people that we saw. I write in Chasing Hope about the son of a Politburo member called Wu Xietian was the Politburo member, and his son was the head of Beijing radio. And when Tiananmen happened, he gave the newsreader a script saying the Chinese army is massacring people. And so the soldiers came to arrest the newsreader, and then Wu Xiaoyong said, don't arrest him, I'm the one who ordered him to read that. And the soldiers weren't going to arrest the son of a Politburo member, so they went back and consulted Li Peng, the prime minister, and he said, no, go ahead and arrest him. And this sent, I guess I had expected, seeing so many bright lights who really wanted a more open system in ways that reminded me of Poland before and Eastern Europe before 1989. I thought it would be more likely to evolve in those directions. And I do think that history is contingent. And I think that Russia evolved in certain ways because in 1999, an accident of history, Boris Yeltsin chose this guy named Vladimir Putin. And otherwise, Russia might have gone in a somewhat different direction. And I think that if Xi Jinping had been the number 2 rather than the number 1 when he was chosen, that China might have evolved in somewhat different directions as well.
But on the other hand, you can't fault the authorities. They've just done so remarkably well. Yeah. I mean, it's basically they've created a miracle. And if you look over the expanse of time since Tiananmen to now, I mean, the Chinese economy has transformed, and so all that energy that couldn't go into politics went into economics.
That's a paradox, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think in some ways, while they have transformed and multiplied their economy zillions of times, what about America? Where have we gone? We have stood still. We are growing slowly, but we basically have stood still, and we're basically still trying to stay a little bit ahead of China on so many fronts. And it just makes you realize that, who are we to criticize, because they have been able to, create a somewhat command economy that has allowed people to flourish. All right, so their GDP per capita is 12, 13,000, and ours is 80,000. We have still a lot more, but and our economy has grown as well. But we have a working class that basically has stood still. I mean, wages among the working class are basically the same, accounting for inflation, as they were in the 1970s, 1980s. Whereas in China, they've just skyrocketed for everyone. So, there's something to learn from that.
And your book, Nick, and you see this picture. Here's Nick with his hands raised up to heaven. I mean, this book is so filled with optimism and hope. And this, it seems to me, in the description you've just given of China, is the values proposition is what is still missing there, right? And I want to just read for you this little thing that, because I'm curious, Nick, how you evolved into being such a hopeful character. Let's see, I've got to find it here. This is a note that Nick found that his father had written. When he looked him up, was this in Widener Library? Yeah. That his father came, well, I'll let you tell the story, but many countries in Eastern Europe finally got to America and was nonetheless filled with this kind of deep idealism, which I think permeates all your writing, Nick, and this book is just dripping with it. So let me just read this and then ask you about it. Here's what Nick found in this Who's Who entry about his own father, who had moved to Oregon, bought this farm where Nick grew up. We want war, want, and concentration camps, exile from home and homeland. These have made me hate strife among men, but they have not made me lose faith in the future of mankind. Personal experience, including my own unsteady progress through life, has taught me to be aware of man's capacity for plain, stupid, irrational, as well as consciously evil behavior. But it has also taught me that man has an even greater capacity for recovery from lapses. In short, I remain a rationalist, an optimist, and at a time when the prophets of doom have the floor, my query is, if man has been able to create the arts, the sciences, and the material civilization we know in America, why should he be judged powerless to create justice, fraternity, and peace? And I can just see the taproot of your being sort of sunk into your father and how it's influenced everything you've written. And from that perspective, China must have been a bit of a travail for you.
Yeah, people are always they ask me, how is it that you can have had a career covering massacres and genocide and human rights abuses, sex trafficking, and poverty, disease, and emerge,
hopeful,
reasonably hopeful. And I think part of it may just be brain chemistry inherited from my dad, but I think that there's also
tell people a little bit, just very quickly, all of the various transmigrations of the soul your father went through in different countries in the war.
So my dad was, my dad's family, they were ethnic Armenians, growing up in Eastern Europe, in what was variously in my dad's life, Austria-Hungary, Romania, Soviet Union, and now southern Ukraine, southwestern Ukraine. They spied on the Nazis during World War II. They got caught. Some family members were executed by the Nazis. Others were executed by the Soviet communists. They fled in every direction. My dad fled to Yugoslavia, was in a concentration camp. A French diplomat intervened to save his life, and somewhat breaking the rules to do so. And then in 1952, my dad was able to come to the U.S. and settled in Oregon, not speaking any English. His first purchase upon arriving in the U.S. was a Sunday New York Times as his language material to learn English. There's something poetic about that. But, you know, I think that in journalism, we focus sometimes so much on all the crises, which are real and important and deserve to be covered, but that we also lose sight of a backdrop of progress. And so, you know, when I graduated from college, 11% of children worldwide died by the age of 5. Now we're down to 3%. When I was a kid, a majority of human beings, of adults, had always been illiterate throughout human history. Now we're pushing 90% adult literacy. 300,000 people move out of extreme poverty every day around the world. And I guess the other thing is that side by side with the worst of humanity, when you're out in the field, you see the very best in ways that seem utterly inspiring. And for example, that terrible night of Tiananmen, when the troops were moving in to crush the students on the old Beijing Airport Road, which I'm sure some of you know, there was a huge convoy of troops that evening headed toward Tiananmen. A bus driver saw them, and he parked his bus across the road to block the convoy of troops. And he turned the engine off, he stepped out, had the keys in his hand, and the convoy had to come to a stop. An officer got out of the lead truck and ordered him, "Move the bus." The bus driver said no. The officer pointed his sidearm at the bus driver and said, "Move the bus." And the bus driver took the keys and hurled them as far as he could into the high grass by the side of the road. And just a reminder that when we are tested, we are capable of extraordinary courage. And that we also, I mean, I think I've also thought about this in the context of recent events in America. And I think that in China, because people had not inherited democracy and lived in an authoritarian regime, they understood more deeply the perils of authoritarianism in ways that galvanized them to seek a more democratic country. I do think there's something we can learn from the courage of people like that.
I mean, you repeatedly speak in this book, Nick, about sort of values driving your journalism, and you're constantly being tempted to try to help people, which normal journalistic rules might not think are proper. So let me ask you, Sheryl, what's it like living with this guy who is so idealistic and so kind of clings to hope in such a hopeful way? How do you feel about this?
Well, I think it's really a pragmatic hope. I mean, I do think that, you know, there's a certain pragmatism, you know, that what is it that we can achieve? Because if you look at, you know, he just cited some statistics in terms of poverty. We really are making progress on that front because there are measurable, you know, goals. And I think that when you can measure something, you tend to want to actually do better and better.
And China is certainly a poster child for getting better in these concrete.
Absolutely, absolutely. Somehow it hasn't always worked in the U.S. and in all parts of the U.S. So I do think that, you know, the fact that we've made so much progress gives you hope that you can continue this progress. I mean,
do you feel hopeful as he does?
It's infectious. It's like a virus. Look
Well,
out.
I think it
You're
is.
going to emerge really optimistic.
Another reason to read this book.
Yeah, no, I am hopeful because even in the U.S., if you take examples here in the U.S., in Oregon, we see how the high school graduation rates have gone down, and how K through 12 education is not doing very well. The reading levels are pretty poor, and then we think, oh my goodness, Oregon is just falling down the drain. But then you think, wow, look at Mississippi. So everybody remembers when Mississippi was like the worst, right? In the Mississippi education school system, you think, oh my God, you're never as bad as Mississippi. They used to be number 49. Now they're number 39, and they're going to 38. And Oregon's falling. Well, actually, there are ways that they actually improved. Let's copy them. So there are things that one can do, that these things are doable. They're not impossible. And so I think that's the kind of thing, because it is measurable, a lot of the statistics around education are measurable, that I do think that it is possible, if you break down the problem, that you can actually make progress.
Did you lose hope in some respects after 1989? And when you said in your book something that to the effect that China is the country I wanted to be able to love.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty shattering to be on Tiananmen Square and to see a modern army use modern weapons of war against protesters, and then to see this systematic, deliberate crackdown on the universities and workplaces. Friends were fired, imprisoned, and it was happening all over the country. And it was utterly dispiriting. And since then, as Sheryl says, it's complicated. On the one hand, a baby born in Beijing today has a longer life expectancy than a baby born in Washington, D.C. On the other hand, the brutality in Xinjiang toward the Uyghurs, the crackdown on religion, on free speech, et cetera, and just the degree to which Xi Jinping has tried to turn himself into this sort of more modern version of Mao, I find truly dispiriting. But I do, I've seen the changes happening elsewhere in Asia. I covered the democratic revolution, in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Mongolia, in Indonesia, bits of it in Thailand. And I think that, at some point, that when you have a middle class, when you have a more educated population, a more international population, there are pressures for greater openness and greater responsiveness. It's very hard to predict when they will happen, and there's no clear timeline, but at some point, I think that will happen.
So, you both haven't been covering China per se for some time, but I think you said, Sheryl, and I think you're right, that once you kind of get buddied up with it, it's hard to get unstuck. So when you look at what's happening now, how do you explain it?
I think that, as I mentioned earlier, I do think that a lot of energy in China was redirected to the economy and to, focusing on getting rich. They were allowed to they were finally given permission to get rich, and they just ran with it. And I think education played an incredibly key role. So you think about a just grand country like China, and then you look at Haiti, and Haiti in the same time span has not been able to get itself off, off the doldrums.
Because highest point was Papa Doc.
Yeah.
And even though, they've been told you've got to focus on education, China now, in terms of education, it's unbelievable. So 60% of high school grads go on to college. That's like the U.S. The U.S. 62%, of American high school graduates go to college, community college included. Now, we may not have as high high school graduation rates as China even, but you think, oh my gosh, they've got this huge youth unemployment, but that's also because they have so many graduates from college. In 2025, they're going to graduate 12 million, college graduates. That's just a huge number. That's unfathomable. So it is hard to figure out how can an economy deploy and employ so many smart, intelligent graduates. But it's that education that really allowed them to now be in where they were 3.5 decades ago, like on the lowest totem pole. They were like communist mentality, no service attitude, to be in an AI arms race with the most advanced country in the world. They actually have surpassed the U.S. in something. The hypersonic missile they were able to send off, and we haven't even gotten to that point. So it's incredible that they have been able to pull off the kind of technological advances, economic advances. I mean, under Xi Jinping, the growth rate has slowed dramatically, and he has not been as good a steward of the economy as his predecessors were. And so the growth rate has slowed, and it still remains to be seen whether they can reform the state sector and to really find this next engine of growth, especially as they have an aging population. They've got a lot of challenges, so the miracle is on the wane. But I wouldn't underestimate them, and they still are very far ahead in the AI race. They're very strong in certain areas.
It is counterintuitive, and I wonder, Nick, how do you explain that? I mean, the conventional wisdom was that a Leninist regime is too restricted, constricting, controlling, to actually be able to do what, in effect, in certain ways we've seen China do, but of course in other ways it hasn't moved forward. But how do you explain that? I mean, did you think that when you two landed there in, what was it, 88?
So I think that, we see these correlations between countries modernizing their economies, becoming more educated, getting a middle class, and becoming more democratic. But it is worth remembering that that correlation is extremely inexact. And Singapore was extremely wealthy before it was really becoming less authoritarian. And in some degree, that required Lee Kuan Yew leaving the scene. Taiwan was under martial law until, 1986 or 1987, and was still, the Navy killed a Taiwanese dissident in the U.S., Henry Liu, in, I guess, the early 80s. South Korea, likewise, was so repressive until quite suddenly in 1988 things changed. And
we forget that Japan was once an autocracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And and Russia has gone Russia was very educated and had a real middle class, and then has gone, of course, backwards, really as a reaction to economic turmoil since 1999. So I think that that all is that this relationship is very inexact, and those things correlate, but there's a long tether between them. And all I know is that over time there will be this propensity for a middle class to want, greater chance to participate in decision making. That when people are educated and they can get 5 choices of coffee at their local coffee bar, they also tend to want some choices in the decisions that rule over them. I think China has benefited from the fact that it has performed exceedingly well in terms of living standards for so many people. I think that you get the sense that that is running out a little bit, and that there are deep economic frustrations right now around the country. There's frustration at the corruption, and I think Xi Jinping was very, very shrewd in presenting himself as a man of the people, cracking down on corruption, and using the anti-corruption campaigns to really get rid of rivals. But that frustration, I think, really runs deep, and at some point, and it may be rapid as it was in South Korea or Taiwan or Indonesia, I think will have an impact.
I think that would be interesting to see, because right now I think China's kind of at that point where you have, it used to be very institutional. Everything was for the party, everything was for the elaborate authoritarian government. It didn't matter who was in the top spot, right? Because they were very institutional. Xi Jinping has changed that. He's personalized the leadership in China. So it's now kind of about a cult about, Xi Jinping, right? Which is what we're seeing here in the U.S. too. We're kind of moving from institutions to the cult of a personality, right? It's personal leadership, not the institution. So it'll be interesting to see, obviously they're coming at it from opposite ends of the pole, but it will be interesting to see how the U.S. China relationship evolves around these two different
Now we have
cult of personalities.
two countries in a kind of an unsteady state, unpredictable state. Let me ask you to react to the following proposition, that it is unlikely that a state that's had a Leninist, Marxist-Leninist revolution and structured along Leninist one-party lines can peacefully evolve into something else without some enormous disruption. So please respond.
I mean, Taiwan was organized on Leninist party lines.
But not quite as, yes, but not as well as China, if I may say.
The Kuomintang had pretty tight control over modest-sized island.
Yeah, okay, I'll give you that one.
You look at, and likewise, you look at what Park Chung-hee did in Gwangju in 1980 or whatever.
But this wasn't part of the Comintern, part of the whole, Leninist complex, global complex.
But you do, you have seen another, you saw what happened under Yeltsin and the degree to which you have these structures that can change very quickly in the case of the old Soviet Union, for example, or other communist countries, Poland, Romania, et cetera. It always struck me that some of these countries had alternative power centers. So that Poland had the Catholic Church, for example, and that China has been quite successful in preventing any kind of other power center from emerging.
It did allow entrepreneurs to emerge, but now it's beginning to dampen.
And then Xi Jinping decided that was the beginning of sort of alternative power structures. But he suppressed them at the cost of undermining the economy and weakening China's competitiveness and undermining job opportunities for all these people graduating from college in ways that I think do create challenges for him.
But I do think that he saw the level of resistance under COVID when he had the crackdown on Shanghai and realized he had to give in. So I do think that he knows that there are limits and that he has to make sure that he does address the economic factors earlier or soon, because he is going to lose the mandate, so to speak. He's got, they are trying to be strategic. So, yes, they are trying to, find jobs, and now there are all these programs at the universities where they're bringing companies on, just like what we do here in the U.S., bring companies on campus to recruit so they can get jobs just upon graduation. So they're trying to do things that will help with the high unemployment. It's like 19% among the 16 to 24-year-old. It's really, really high unemployment among that. They have so many college graduates. Who would have thought that they would have had so many that they can't employ them? But they're also being strategic, because now they know that instead of the one-child policy, they need to have multiple-child policy, and so they're trying to give tax credits, child care. What we need to do, and we've talked about in this country, they're doing it all, and they're doing it really fast. They're implementing child care credits, maternal care credits, their incentives, child rearing incentives, all sorts of things so that people have more children, because they know that they need this for ongoing as they age. They have an aging society. They need more young youth in the labor force. So I think that China so far has been able to keep a step ahead in planning for just the challenges that they have ahead of them. The one thing they have done very poorly on is the state sector. They have not been able to reform that. But so far, they have defied the odds. Here you were saying, how can a Marxist Lenin, authoritarian state, keep it up for so long, and they have. So I don't know if the technology is extending that run they have, because now with the acute surveillance technology that they have, they're able to keep tabs on everyone, less
controls are
intrusively.
more effective than
Control,
ever.
but also less intrusively. I mean, they have everybody's eyes and now the genetic. Now they've got their genetic makeup. They're doing all sorts of things that are just allowing them to keep tabs on every Chinese citizen. So they may be able to extend this with technology for a lot longer than we think.
So one key element in this equation, of course, is their relation with the outside world. And I'm wondering how you two, having watched this for a long time, analyze the fundamental notion that there's a hostile contradiction between the People's Republic of China and the whole system and the so-called Western outside democratic world. In the 80s, we thought that might be tempered. How do you look at it now? Do you think that's an abiding thing? I mean, because there is a deep sort of passionate adoration and infatuation and love of America too, hiding someplace within China. How do you look at it now?
It struck me that in the 1980s, as people stopped believing in communism, that as ideological faith disappeared, that there was really a deliberate effort to use nationalism as a new glue to have the country cohere, and that this nationalism was nurtured partly through propaganda and partly by really encouraging people through the education system of seeing all of Chinese history through the prism of foreign countries working kind of nonstop to humiliate China, to dismember China, and so that foreign actions would be seen through that prisms in ways that would encourage doubt among Chinese toward other powers.
And Leninism excited precisely that sentiment that we are the oppressed, the preyed upon, the occupied, colonialized.
Right, and that when foreigners talk about Xinjiang, they're just trying to dismember China. When they talk about Hong Kong, this is just an effort to dismember China, just as like they did with the Opium Wars. This kind of thing, and I think to some degree, that has worked. I think nationalism is pretty high. I think for strange reasons, it's a lot more directed at Japan than at the West, even though China fought Americans more recently in the Korean War, and that nationalism troubles me. One of the times I was really saddest about bilateral relations was after 9/11, and I was looking at some Chinese online message boards when people were freer to comment, and ordinary Chinese were writing gleefully about 9/11, and I don't think they fully understood how awful it was, but it was, the comments were all along the lines of, cool. Oh, this teaches them. They think they want to boss the world, and now, they're vulnerable to some planes. And there was this window into a deep, deep resentment that people felt at China being bullied and bossed. And I think that has been used quite shrewdly by the regime as a tool to stay in power, that only, that we can defend Chinese interests, but it also, I think, creates real risks for Chinese policy. What's the expression? 骑虎难下.
Yeah,
骑虎难下. It's easy to get on the back of a tiger, but harder to get off. And I think there are real risks in vis-a-vis Taiwan, and maybe especially vis-a-vis the Philippines. Because they have gotten on the back of a tiger.
But I would say that during this time where Xi Jinping really hasn't done very well by the economy, what he has done well is externally with the rest of the world. I mean, he really has put China on the map. in a way that China had always been very reticent to do, and saying, oh no, we're still a developing country. He is, when it's very convenient, he still says they're a developing country, so he doesn't have to put up money to any of the international organizations. But he has put China on the map with his Belt and Road Initiative, with reaching out to all parts of the world as a way of saying, I'm in competition with the U.S. I'm not going to let the U.S., the Western world, dictate the way we, see the world. We're going to create our counter world. And they basically have. I mean, they're throughout Africa, Latin America, Asia. They've gone everywhere, because they have now more clout with money. They can actually throw around money. They're so good at building infrastructure. Not all of the projects have done very well, but they've done a lot better than the U.S. has done. I mean, the U.S. has not done much at all.
Okay, so
in response.
that is all true. So explain to me then your view on why have they also at the same time antagonized and pissed off so many countries all around the world gratuitously toward no good end that I can perceive. How do you explain that?
It's a little bit colonial, the way they're approaching it. And so I think that they have to learn how to do a little bit better. And there are agreements where they have to deploy local employees. They used to bring the Chinese in, which the local economies hated. And so now they're trying to change their ways. It's going to take time, and they just have to learn how to be better, how to be more diplomatic. They have to learn a little bit better how to manage that side of it. But the countries also are still grateful because they have the roads built, they have the ports built, they've got things that work, and the U.S. is nowhere in sight. I mean, it's like
You have to be there.
yeah, and the U.S. is nowhere in these places, and so I mean they're kind of industrializing Africa. They will be there before any other power in terms of helping Africa, which still is not having its own industrial revolution yet, but they're there.
Before we, I want to actually, before we get to questions, which we're going to get to here, I also want to ask you about U.S. and China now. But Nick, maybe you should answer that question. Why is China antagonizing Norway, Canada? Who antagonizes Canada?
Yeah. I mean, I think Xi Jinping miscalculated. I think he blew it. And I mean, it's notable that in some ways, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump are a little bit parallel in the sense that they're impetuous. They're quite cocksure, I think, of themselves.
Or is it insecure, making them act
some balance
like the cock
of the two,
walk.
which leads them to act in very impetuously. And just as Trump is quite dismissive of career foreign service people, Xi Jinping, I think, doesn't have a lot of time for the foreign ministry in China, which he thinks is all these, weak diplomats who are soft on America. And so he took a foreign policy and he just pushed it too far, and he antagonized, as you say, Australia, Europe,
even
Southeast
Sweden.
Asia. I mean, across the board. And he does seem to have retreated a little bit now. I mean,
He was provoked. I mean, in the case of Canada, I mean, the Huawei incident, that was...
Yes, but
he was
Australia just wanted a review of the virus, and they got slammed. I mean, India, they went... there's so many cases where it seems to me I don't quite understand the logic.
And I think there was I think they acknowledged that it was a failure, and that's why he's backed off with India, with Canada, with Australia. With Europe, they have a problem with EVs, but I think Chinese quietly will acknowledge that he didn't listen enough to the foreign ministry, and he just rode roughshod over other countries and thought he could bully them, and they paid a price diplomatically for that, and have tried to rebuild things a little bit since then. But at the same time, they've also been trying to rebuild this axis with Russia, and with
Iran.
Although it is notable that, like after the Pelosi visit to Taiwan, I thought that China was going to be supplying lethal weapons to Russia, and so far they have been quite careful about providing dual-use equipment to Russia, but not just flat-out supplying all-out weaponry, which would have been catastrophic for Ukraine.
But it's a drone war, and they're supplying all the drones. So
Yeah, I mean, it's a friendship without limits, and Putin's met Xi Jinping, what, 43 times? 44 times?
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit odd. Okay, before we get to questions from you, I just want you two to anoint us with some sage thoughts about how the advent of Donald Trump will change the chemistry with China. What are your thoughts? I mean, I know it's a contradiction, but...
So I worry about the security implications, and the way I see that is I think that because of Trump's election, Russia is more likely to secure a kind of triumphant victory in Ukraine, not necessarily, not reaching Kiev, but that there will be, it's more likely that Russia will emerge from this looking good, that aggression paid off. And I think that is a terrible message to send to Xi Jinping. I'm critical of the Biden administration in many respects, but one thing they did brilliantly was link together Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines in creating this network to build a real security partnership in the South China Sea and East China Sea.
Do you think deterrence is the best antidote to anything happening there?
In Asia?
Yeah,
so, and I think that, that will likely fragment now under Trump. And I worry that that sends signals that give Xi Jinping more latitude to bully Taiwan. And I don't think that leads to an all-out invasion. But I think that it could mean, especially if President Lai of Taiwan miscalculates, to efforts like snipping undersea cables, internet cables to Taiwan, or a quasi-quarantine around Taiwan to push back ships carrying energy to Taiwan, things like that. And, I think that Biden probably would have intervened to protect energy shipments to Taiwan. I have a hard time imagining President Trump being told that, ships carrying natural gas to Taiwan are being stopped and inspected and turned back. I have a hard time imagining the Trump administration acting promptly to address that in ways that I fear reduce deterrence and increase the risk of action and miscalculation. Still don't think it's likely, but I think there is a non-negligible increased risk of a crisis there or with the Philippines.
I think there are a couple things that might mitigate it. One is that Taiwan is very aware of Trump's comments about transactions, like Taiwan should pay a little bit more, so they'll just up the amount of money that they pay for their F-16s, right? And the other thing is that the Trump administration is very concerned about keeping all the IP for the GPUs that go over to Asia. And so I would be surprised if they loosened the restrictions on sending advanced computer chips, advanced GPU chips to China. That they may even strengthen that. They may even make it even stronger.
it's really hard to judge, isn't it? You don't quite know which direction they're going to run.
Right. Although Trump has said that he doesn't want any IP leaving American soil. He wants America first.
But I could imagine Michelle going over to Beijing and hugging it out with Xi Jinping and, okay, take TSMC, what the hell,
Yeah, so, he invites Xi Jinping over to Mar-a-Lago again, and you never know what happens. They get drunk.
Chocolate cake and the whole 9 yards.
Right. He is unpredictable, if anything. But that could be a mitigating factor if they do decide to make sure that the controls stay pretty strong on that, because that does impede China's ability to, compete both in AI and also in the military weapon systems where they need the advanced chips. So, but that doesn't mean they can't do a quarantine. That's still possible, or cut the undersea cables. But Taiwan has said that even cutting their undersea cables, they can repair them. I mean, that's a temporary,
But it's the nibbling strategy
Yeah,
that's hard
yeah.
to know how to
Right.
respond to.
Right, right.
All right. Any closing comments, brief comments by you two before we turn to the audience?
One thing that writing the book kind of forced me to wrestle with was, looking at China in perspective and at journalistic ethics and how we weigh in journalism our obligations to our news organizations and to coverage versus those of our obligations to people, if you will. And the incident that I wrestled with, I think, more than any other ethical conflict in my entire career came after Tiananmen, because there was a young man from Tsinghua University who had helped us cover the democracy movement and the crackdown afterward. And then partly because he had helped us, he ended up in prison, he escaped from prison, and then he came to Beijing and asked for our help in fleeing the country. The one pretty basic rule of being a foreign correspondent is you don't help an escaped felon flee the country. On the other hand, here's a 19-year-old guy who had been in prison only because he had helped New York Times readers. And if we didn't help him, at some point he was going to get caught, and terrible things would have happened. And trying to weigh our responsibilities to him versus to the New York Times, we thought if we did help him, and we were caught, we would be in trouble. The New York Times bureau might be closed down. And I was also, I'd never heard of anybody escaping from a Chinese prison before. I wondered if this was all some setup to try to entrap us. But we did end up helping him, and he was able to get first to Hong Kong, and then we helped him get to the U.S. And it was the most unprofessional thing I've ever done in my career, but it was also one that I'm proudest of. And, I think of that tension between our obligations to journalistic principles and our obligations to people that we encounter in the course of our reporting, and how we reconcile them, I think is an ongoing challenge in journalism.
And I think, Nick, your book is replete with examples of you struggling with this exact question of how do you be a human being when you also have to be a professional, and there are rules of the road, but you're constantly running into people who are suffering. What do you do?
Yeah.
So I would say that, just a few words, that our initial reaction to the way China has been acting on the world stage is to recoil and say, I don't want to have anything to do with it. But I would still say that engagement still has value, and that we should still try and engage with as many Chinese on as many fronts, just like the Asian Society does, as possible, because I do think that I do believe in the peaceful evolution. And I just, it's one by one. I mean, you just, it's.
It sounds good, but they don't like it in Beijing.
So that means they're scared of it.
Yeah.
No, but I would encourage you to still have as many interactions as possible.
Yeah. Okay, so let's have a few questions. I think we can see you. Raise your hand, and there are microphones around that will come to you. Let's see. Way in the back. Yeah, the woman in the very back row there. Let's see.
When they
Excuse
have
me?
the mics, when they have the mics, they'll just speak.
The mics are what?
When they have the mics, they'll just speak. So over there.
Oh, I think...
I have a question.
Hi.
Oh, okay,
mic
sorry.
wants to
Sorry,
speak.
couldn't see you. Go ahead.
To what extent, if any, might the U.S. learn anything from Chinese communist economic or legal theory?
That sounds like that's in your wheelhouse, Sheryl.
Well, I do think that we have a lot to learn from their persistence on education. And I think in this country, where a state or a community will be in the next 20 years will be sort of determined or reflected in how good their education is at the grade school level. And if we don't have good grade schools, if we can't get our kids reading by third grade, fourth grade, and doing math by third and fourth grade and fifth and sixth, we aren't going to be able to win this race. STEM is important. Those 12 million Chinese graduates from college, the majority are going to be in STEM, and that's not the case here in the U.S. And we need to really shore up our education system. So I think that learning from just the emphasis on education really will help us build our economy. We need a certain level of skill because even with AI, it's going to be able to help us do a lot of different things, and a lot of jobs are going to change. And so we need to be educated enough to be able to adapt and be flexible. I think the education is really what gives us flexibility as a country. The U.S., the reason why it did so well, in the past couple centuries is that we were the pioneers of mass education. Mass, at the grade school level, at the high school level, we were the pioneers, but we have actually lost that leadership. We no longer have the best, K-12 education system. We no longer educate at the mass level the way we used to. And so we really don't want to lose that edge, because I think it shows up in technological advances. We are at the most advanced right now, but we need to sustain that edge over the next generation, the next 2 and 3 generations as well.
The only other way to do that, of course, is immigration.
Well,
and
yes.
that's a very sticky wicket these days, too.
Absolutely.
Okay, there was a woman in the back, or I can't see whoever has a microphone, just jump up and, okay, let's go back there. Maybe introduce yourself quickly so we know who you are.
My name is Jade Holmgren. My question is just, Nick, earlier you mentioned that the Chinese government for a very long time, they had been very, very guarded against foreign influence. They are afraid of people, government level, anybody to have contact with foreigners, and kind of that the pollution of the foreign ideas. How do you think they rationalize that the country has been under the foreign influence or even foreign control since the establishment of the Communist Party in China, and communism is not innate in Chinese culture?
In other words, given the rhetoric about foreign pressure and foreign pollution, then how do they justify what?
They have a foreign ideology, Marxism.
Oh, I see,
Yeah.
I see, right. Well, I mean, the university student protesters are always pointing that out. Here we celebrate, Chineseness of things, and yet everything is originating with the foreign philosophy. I really don't think that anybody, including probably Xi Jinping, really actually believes in this sort of ideology. So I think it's kind of a test. That's maybe another parallel to Trump, that I don't think that people in the Trump orbit necessarily believe that that he won the 2020 election, but it becomes a loyalty test. And I think likewise in China, a lot of the ideology is basically a loyalty test. In the book, I talk about chatting with the widow of a former really hardline foreign minister, and his widow was saying, he never believed all that hardline stuff he was talking about, but who could he admit that to but me? And I think that there's probably a lot of that going on around the country.
All right, next question, also in the back there.
Hi, I'm Wolf Hertzberg. I took a class a few years ago with Dali Young, I don't know if you know, at the University of Chicago, and he cited you, Mr. Kristof, on Tiananmen. When he gave a lecture on Tiananmen, he said, Nick Kristof at the New York Times ran around to hospitals that night and asked them, how many people died in your emergency ward tonight? And that's how you got the death toll. And he's a very distinguished Chinese scholar, and he said, I don't have anything better. That's how many people I think died. So A, is that true? You're nodding. B, what do you think of these top China scholars, that's their best estimate. And C, when I learned that, I remember thinking, I can't believe that worked, that was allowed. I imagine that wouldn't work today, whatever the comparable situation is.
We owe some credit to the great New York Times foreign editor of the time, Joe Lelyveld, later became the executive editor, and he was talking to Sheryl
Right.
all that evening and saying, talk to the hospitals.
You have to start collecting the numbers of the dead. So I had to start collecting the numbers of the dead while while Nick was on the square. And so we already knew that there were hospitals getting, the injured. And so we were calling the hospitals. And then later on that evening, we went to the hospitals because they stopped talking to us on the phone. In the beginning, they were actually horrified. And they were saying, oh, my God, yes, we've got all these people who are, dying and are injured. But then there must have been a missive that went out. And then they wouldn't talk on the phone anymore. So we actually had to go to the hospital.
They're probably too busy, too.
Well, and no, not to mention, of course, they were busy, and they were horrified by they were just literally, people were horrified by what was going on. But we had to visit some of the hospitals, and we just saw people lying on the floors because they didn't have enough beds. But that was something that our foreign editor clued us into very early on, and we really tried to dig. And then, in the ensuing days, it was really hard to get estimates, and we, had to cull from as many different places as possible.
Our estimate was between 400 and 800 died in Beijing, and that was lower than a lot of the other estimates that were going around. But I have a lot of confidence in that, partly because there is some kind of accepted ratio of the number of injured you would expect per the number killed. And it might be 5 times as much, it might be 10 times as much, but it wouldn't be, the same number. And so it would be, there were thousands that were injured, but there weren't tens of thousands who had been shot and needed hospital care. And one of the things that I learned in the next few days, which has also been a useful lesson in covering conflicts later, is that victims lie too. And when you're covering a terrible tragedy, a genocide, or whatever it may be, you know that the authorities and the perpetrators are going to lie. But what you learn is that victims are outraged at what they've seen. And so they fight back by exaggerating. And they say that they witnessed something when they actually only heard it secondhand. They add to the numbers. And I've seen that in place after place, and I saw that at Tiananmen when you had student protesters who were talking about the Tiananmen Square being knee-deep in blood, and huge massacres right there in the middle of the square. And I was in Tiananmen Square. I knew that had not happened. And it was awful enough that one didn't need to embellish it.
The spin started the next day. I mean, we were getting phone calls, 2,500 people were killed, and we said that there's just no way that, where did that happen? We didn't see it. 2,500 people, you have to be able to see that. That's a huge number. So it was very interesting to see that both sides were spinning.
Well, it was a sad day, June 4th, 1989, and it's something that party's done the best it can to erase it from memory, but I'm afraid it's there in history for eternity. And you guys did a wonderful job that night, and you won the Pulitzer Prize. Congratulations. And thank you both for coming. Thank you. Thank you.